Is your prologue making your story stronger or killing it before chapter 1 even starts? In this video, I'm going to break down if you really even need a prologue, and if you do, how to make sure it's compelling enough to hook readers instead of killing their engagement. Why does George R.R. Martin open a Game of Thrones with a chilling scene beyond the wall before we've met a single Stark or Lannister? Why does Stephen Pressfield frame Gates of Fire as a survivor's testimony before we start chapter 1? Why does Peter Watts start one of my favourite novels, Blindsight, with the effects of a brain surgery that never returns as a plot event but changes how we read the entire thing? Clearly, the issue isn't prologues themselves. So before we get into how to use one effectively, we should start by helping you understand what I mean by whether a prologue works and if your story needs one at all. A prologue is never just about style, it's a structural necessity, and the only reason you should write one is if your story doesn't make sense without it. If chapter 1 can't stand on its own, then you obviously want to fix that, and you might need to use a prologue to give us the framing context we need to make the rest of the story work for us. Think about it like this. When you sit down to play a board game, there's always that little instruction booklet, and that's not because the publisher wanted to bore you, but because without those few rules up front, you wouldn't know how to actually play the game. And a prologue functions in the same way. It gives your reader the essential orientation, the things they need to know, so that when chapter 1 begins, they're already fluent in the world, the lens to approach your story through, and some of the stakes up front. They've got that context sorted so that you can just lock them in your narrative flow and they know it's going to make sense. And we'll use the examples I mentioned earlier with links to them in the description and start with Stephen Pressfield's Gates of Fire. You see, chapter 1 drops us straight into a Spartan boyhood training scene, but the prologue has already revealed to us that everything we're reading from that point is a testimony of a single survivor of Thermopylae, recorded after the Spartans' defeat. By order of His Majesty Xerxes, son of Darius, great king of Persia and Media, king of kings, king of the lands, master of Libya, Egypt, Arabia, Ethiopia, Babylonia, Chaldea, Phoenicia, Elam, Syria, Assyria, Lord of all men, from the rising to the setting sun, his most holy, reverend, and exalted, invincible, incorruptible, and blessed of the god Ahura Mazda, and omnipotent among mortals. Thus decreeth his magnificence, as recorded by Gobartes, the son of Artabazos, his historian, that, following the glorious victory of His Majesty's forces over the arrayed Peloponnesian foe, Spartans and allies, at the pass of Thermopylae, having extinguished the enemy to the last man, and erected trophies to this valorous conquest, yet was His Majesty, in his God-inspired wisdom, desirous of further intelligence, both of certain infantry tactics employed by the enemy which proved of some effect against His Majesty's troops, and of the type of foemen these were who, though unbound by liege law or servitude, facing insuperable odds and certain death, yet chose to remain at their stations, and perished therein to the final man. His Majesty's regret having been expressed at the dearth of knowledge and insight upon these subjects, then did intercede God Ahura Mazda on His Majesty's behalf. A survivor of the Hellenes, as the Greeks call themselves, was discovered, grievously wounded and in a state of extremis beneath the wheels of a battle wagon, being unseen therefore too due to the presence of numerous corpses of men, horses, and beasts of transport being heaped upon the site. His Majesty's surgeons being summoned and charged under pain of death to spare no measure to preserve the captive's life, God yet granted His Majesty's desire. The Greek survived the night and the morning following. Within 10 days the man had recovered speech and mental faculty, and though yet confined to a utter and under direct care of the royal surgeon, was able not only at last to speak, but to express his fervent desire to do so. So here, in the first 2 paragraphs, we are being given what I call the contextual setup. We are establishing the specific character-focused circumstances around how this story has come to be told, why, and who will be telling it. And of course, the first paragraph opening in the way it does with titles and lands owned by Xerxes, the king of Persia, establishes the time and place immediately that this story, this novel, is taking place in. We know straight away we're in the Bronze Age, and it tells us the point of view of the narrator of this prologue and their place in the story, clarifying the story world of this novel and the events that have led to the account we are now being primed to read from chapter 1 onward. Without that prologue, we as the reader would waste time and mental energy having to figure out who this narrator is, why they're speaking to us, why we're learning this information, and what frame we're in. Lots of things would be going on that would mentally exhaust us and potentially confuse us to the point we just put the book down. But the prologue clears all of that away, so we can dive into chapter 1 without distraction, and events can unfold making simple sense. Or if we look at Peter Watts' sci-fi novel Blind Sight, the book is about first contact with aliens, but its prologue isn't aliens at all. It's the childhood surgery of the narrator Siri Keaton. Half his brain is removed in an operation that changes the way Siri perceives reality. And that single scene actually sets the philosophical stakes of this novel. What does it mean to be human, and what is the role of consciousness in that experience? It's actually giving us the vital lens we need to interpret everything that follows in the story. Two of the enemy twitched at my feet. I kicked one in the head until it stopped moving, turned to the other. Something grabbed my arm and I swung without thinking, without looking, until Pag yelped and ducked out of reach. "Oh," I said, "sorry." One thing lay motionless. The other moaned and held its head and curled up in a ball. "Oh shit," Pag panted. Blood coursed unheeded from his nose and splattered down his shirt. His cheek was turning blue and yellow. "Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit." I thought of something to say. "You alright?" "Oh shit, I mean, you never—" He wiped his mouth. Blood smeared the back of his hand. "Oh man, are we in trouble?" "They started it." "Yeah, but look at them." The moaning thing was crawling away on all fours. I wondered how long it would be before it found reinforcements. I wondered if I should kill it before then. "You'd never have done that before," Pag said. Before the operation, he meant. I actually did feel something then, faint, distant, but unmistakable. I felt angry. "They started." Pag backed away, eyes wide. "What are you doing? Put that down!" I'd raised my fists. I didn't remember doing that. I unclenched them. It took a while. I had to look at my hands very hard. For a long, long time. So these are cases where a prologue isn't optional, it's literally the thing that allows the story to function as the writer intends. But maybe you're now thinking, well, what if my story doesn't actually require that particular type of context? Should I still write a prologue anyway? Most of the time, you don't actually need a prologue, and a prologue is only justified when chapter 1 can't do the jobs of a prologue on its own. And what this means is if your first chapter already introduces the world, establishes the genre and tone, sets up conflict and makes your story promise clear, then you don't need anything else getting in the way of that, because your readers aren't looking for two openings, right? They just want to be pulled straight into your story and get going as fast as possible. If chapter 1 already gets the reader on the roller coaster, why would you make them stand in line for a ticket twice? And the number one mistake that amateur prologues make is delaying that actual story instead of compelling us into it as soon as possible. A prologue's job is to hook them while giving them context. So the simple rule is that if your first chapter can give us the necessary way to orient ourselves in the story world and deliver your story's core offer, its tone, genre, conflict, and its theme, then you don't need a prologue. And if the only reason you're writing one is because you feel the need to front-load explanations, you're probably better off cutting that and finding characterful ways to introduce that information. But if you do decide that your story needs one, that your readers need that little instruction book, then the next question becomes, what kind of prologue are we actually talking about you needing to deliver? The first is what I call a reader context prologue, and this exists to orient the reader before chapter 1 begins. Without it, we'd be confused or misinterpret the frame of the story, so you're essentially handing the reader the lens through which the rest of your novel should be understood. As we mentioned with Blind Sight, the prologue is about the narrator's brain surgery and how that affects how he perceives reality. So the purpose of that prologue is to give us the philosophical lens through which we're going to approach the rest of the book and understand why this story is existing and the deeper questions it's posing, as well as telling us why this protagonist's personal stakes exist and the reason our protagonist is the protagonist at all. Without that, it would either be invisible or have to be information the writer crowbarred in somewhere else, derailing the story experience. The second type of prologue is what I'd call the world context prologue. And this kind doesn't exist to clarify chapter 1, which may already make sense on its own. Instead, it sets up the deeper underlying context of the world the story takes place in. Sometimes it also gives us a kind of ticking clock to dial up tension, even if the characters don't know that clock is ticking, but we as the reader do. Either way, it always helps us to place the events of the story within a bigger picture overall, and that's exactly what George Martin does in A Game of Thrones. The politics of Winterfell in Chapter 1 are crystal clear without the prologue, but that opening scene in the prologue, Beyond the Wall, reframes the entire series. It shows us White Walkers, a supernatural threat most of the cast of characters dismiss for hundreds of pages. So it introduces the genre blend too in that moment to help us as the readers be aware that while what we experience might seem like a political drama, actually we're in a fantasy horror. It plants the truth in the reader's mind, creating dramatic irony and foreshadowing the looming greater stakes of the saga while we wait for the threat of the Walkers to materialize again. So Gates of Fire and Blindsight are reader context prologues. They make sure that we have the lens to understand events from Chapter 1 onward, and A Game of Thrones is an example of a world context prologue. It frames the danger, the theme, and the overall setting that the story takes place in. It's giving us broader context for us to put the rest of the story in. But whichever kind you're writing, it still has to be compelling on its own terms. And that means delivering on a few essential criteria, so here's what they are. First, a compelling prologue must create hooks using intrigue. If it doesn't make the reader lean in with questions, it's dead on arrival. Gates of Fire is a masterclass at this. Several unorthodox aspects of the captive's armour and raiment were noted by the detaining officers. Beneath the man's battle helmet was found not the traditional felt caul of the Spartan hoplite, but the dogskin cap associated with the race of Helots, the Lacedaemonian slave class, serfs of the land. In contrast, inexplicable to His Majesty's officers, the prisoner's shield and armour were of the finest bronze, etched with rare Hibernian cobalt where his armour bore the transverse crest of a full spartiate, an officer. So here we're being given what I call intrigue anchors. The prisoner is now becoming an object of mystery. Their attire, their clothing, doesn't fit with the scribes' assumptions and experience of the Hellenes, the Spartans, and seems paradoxical. So we're being given something from the person's point of view that we are reading that now needs to be made sense of, a promise that will be fulfilled later on. In preliminary interviews, the man's manner of speech proved to be a compound of the loftiest philosophical and literary language, indicative of a deep familiarity with the epics of the Hellenes, intermingled with the coarsest and most crude gutter argot, much of which was uninterpretable even to His Majesty's most knowledgeable translators. The Greek, however, willingly agreed to translate these himself, which he did, utilizing scraps of profane Aramaic and Persian which he claimed to have acquired during certain sea travels beyond Hellas. I, His Majesty's historian, seeking to preserve His Majesty's ears from the foul and often execrable language employed by the captive, sought to excise the offensive material before His Majesty was forced to endure hearing it. Yet did His Majesty, in His God-inspired wisdom, instruct His servant so to translate the man's speech as to render it in whatever tongue and idiom necessary to duplicate the precise effect in Greek. This have I attempted to do. And so this paragraph gives us the second set of intrigue anchors. The prisoner's character is now revealed to be a further mystery in itself. His own speech is a paradox of high and low education, and his uninterpretable speech deepens the character-driven mystery further still. And we are also told that this prisoner is well-travelled, hinting at the possibility of adventure in the story to come. Every layer and every paragraph in this scene raises another question and creates an intrigue anchor. Who is this man? Why is he the survivor? And what truths is he about to tell? That's intrigue doing its job. Second, a compelling prologue must foreshadow the stakes, and A Game of Thrones does this almost better than any other modern fantasy. We know from page 1 of Chapter 1 that while the noble houses fight their petty wars, a greater war looms in the north. The characters may ignore it, but we as the reader can't, and that shadow of doom hangs as a clock over the entire saga. And if we go back to look at Blindsight, having been given the context of the protagonist who we're going to be investing in and whose point of view is going to be telling us the story unfolding from Chapter 1 onward, we then build this prologue through various intrigue anchors. In fact, this prologue begins with an intrigue anchor in the first paragraph. It didn't start out here. Not with the Scramblers or Rorschach, not with Big Ben or Theseus, or the vampires. Most people would say it started with the fireflies, but they'd be wrong. It ended with all those things. So immediately in this first paragraph, we are wondering, what are scramblers, what's Rorschach, what's Big Ben, what's Theseus, and why are there vampires in this story? I thought I was reading a sci-fi. And what are these things called fireflies? And how can it be that if the fireflies begin this thing for some people, it ends it for our protagonist? So we have so many questions introduced that we want answered immediately. Curiosity is being established. Intrigue is being anchored in us. Things we want to be answered. And throughout this prologue's incredible character-driven scene that gives us the vital context of the world we are in and the protagonist's situation themselves, we arrive at the end, where the stakes of the story are established. He may have been wrong, I may have been, but that distance, that chronic sense of being an alien among your own kind, it's not entirely a bad thing. It came in especially handy when the real aliens came calling. Third, a compelling prologue should establish or hint at the novel's central theme. And if you don't know what yours is, you have to figure that out before you write another word. And I've got a full course you can watch that'll teach you how to do that, and I'll link you that here. These examples obviously overlap in giving us the same necessary things like genre clues, but they also individually excel in displaying one of those three vital functions that any prologue needs to have. Gates of Fire shows the power of using compelling hooks, those intrigue anchors that refuse to let the reader go, by generating a load of compelling questions in each paragraph that the story will promise to go on and answer. Blind Sight demonstrates how a prologue can deliver essential context, information without which the story would simply not make sense or feel hollow. And A Game of Thrones prologue encapsulates the story experience overall, distilling the novel's true genre, tone and dramatic DNA in miniature, promising the reader that what they will experience across the larger story is bigger than the scope of what Chapter 1 suggests. So if you're writing a prologue, you need to consider all three and how to put those three elements together, and that will compel your reader forward, equip them with the frame and context they need, and promise the kind of journey they're about to invest in so Chapter 1 can get underway. And now that you know how to decide whether to include a prologue and how to make it work if you decide that you do need one, the next challenge is Chapter 1 itself. What exactly does a first chapter have to do to hook a reader, agent, or publisher? That's what we're going to cover in the next video. So if you haven't already, subscribe, give this video a like, and then join me here in this video where we'll break down Chapter 1 and show you how to craft an irresistible opening that lands the right professional punches.